Nothing matters and everything is a waste of time. Or is it? Today we're going to talk about nihilism and what is the meaning of life. I'm Jonathan Yelland, and this is Finding the Point. Hey guys, welcome to the show. It's great to have everyone with us today. I'm Jonathan Yelland, board certified behavior analyst. With me is our ordained preacher and that great orator of the faith, Pastor Aaron Mudge. How are you doing, Pastor Aaron?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you, John?
I'm doing great. I'm having a very positive, productive day. We get the show going, making some changes in the studio, which hopefully will show up soon in some coming episodes. It's going to be awesome. Today, I wanted to talk about how everything you've done today is totally pointless.
Yeah, that doesn't sound depressing.
Yeah, no, I'm tongue-in-cheek about it, but the concept we want to look at today is what's the meaning of life? What's the point of us? I deal with this more along the lines of research on depression most often.
Yeah.
But I think it's applicable to us just generally speaking as Christians to
Yeah.
look
As a
at,
pastor, I see that a lot in people.
yeah, and we've got to look at, okay, what's the point of us? What are we here? What are we trying to accomplish? Unknowns to many people, I think, the Bible has a solution to depression and these issues of what's the meaning of life in Ecclesiastes. Pastor, I'll let you say it because it's your concept, but the idea that I was taught in school was that Ecclesiastes is a book of poetry. Apparently that's not correct.
No, I would say, and you and I have discussed this, Ecclesiastes isn't really poetry. I mean, it's poetic, but it's really more a book of philosophy. And it really delves into Solomon seeks to tackle the question of, is there any meaning in this life? What is the meaning of life? And so he, with his vast resources, wisdom, and knowledge, gave himself to everything, anything in this world that could possibly give meaning and purpose. And he found none of it gives any purpose at all.
Right.
In fact, he says in Ecclesiastes 1:2, vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity.
Yeah, and it's really unique to me because Solomon's writing well before the Greek philosophers really put together the main solutions that they came forward with, which are essentially the only feasible solutions in a world where God does not exist, which are either hedonism/Epicureanism, which is the purpose of man is to get pleasure. Either the hedonists were like, get the most amount of pleasure you can as much as possible and then die. And the Epicureans were like, well, that's kind of not great. Let's take the most amount of pleasure we can sustainably continue to access. And then the Stoics had a different view, which was, it's oversimplifying it, but essentially do great works that will last beyond your lifetime and accept the position that life has put you in. And so those major philosophies were developed and spread years after Ecclesiastes. But Ecclesiastes is essentially the rebuttal to both of those before they even came out.
Solomon goes into great depth in saying, hey, I gave myself wholly to pleasure, and in the end I found it has no meaning. It has no purpose. Yeah. It's for a moment and then it's gone. And then he said, well, then I gave myself to establishing a legacy and establishing something that's going to last beyond me. But it's meaningless because one day I'm going to die, and I don't know what the person after me is going to do with what I built.
Exactly. And he tears apart those alternating philosophies. So our problem, though, today, Aaron, is that if we're going to have to live in this world, which we do, yep, we can't trust on the Greek philosophers' solutions. The hedonism just doesn't work. The Stoicism just doesn't work. Solomon's experienced it and proved it in his research. What is the actual solution? So to look at this, let's break down the Ecclesiastes model and understand the philosophy here. So it starts with, of course, you've already read Vanity of Vanities, the opening there. But it's this idea that nihilism is actually correct. And nihilism, the philosophy that says nothing we do in the material realm can have any meaning.
Okay? In other words, life is hard and then you die.
That's essentially it. And the nihilists would say there's no moral right or wrong, and they would extend that philosophy to an incorrect position. I think you can see, if you are having a hard time grasping nihilism, the very popular TV show Rick and Morty has sort of preached the nihilist viewpoint. Nothing I do matters, so let's just do random crazy stuff. Whatever seems to come to me is that's the best way to live in the world because nothing matters. Just do whatever you want and then die. So that's the end point of nihilism, is of course that meaninglessness, which leads to depression and death. So it's not a great philosophy. But
No.
they are right on the one point that agrees with the Bible, that all we do is essentially vanity because it will be destroyed through time. And that's what Solomon gets at
Right.
all over in
And we have in
Ecclesiastes.
Psalm 39:5, it says a very similar thing.
Mm-hmm.
Behold, thou hast made my days as an handbreadth, a short period of time, and mine age is as nothing before thee. Verily, every man at his best state is altogether vanity.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very, very well put. So nihilism, the concept that everything we could possibly do is just basically meaningless. I mean, that's a biblical concept. The nihilists sort of take that and say, well, we only exist as material beings. Therefore, if none of the material things we do can have any meaning, then there is no meaning at all to be had, and so we'll do all this evil stuff because of it. But the Christian view and God's way that comes from God's word, and especially is outlined in Ecclesiastes, is that no, that's not the end of it. There is more than the material, and because there's more than the material, we can make choices that have eternal value. So when it comes to mankind, I think the way to think about it is to say, okay, we exist and we know that all things exist for a purpose. You literally can't make something that doesn't have a purpose.
No, I remember you and I talking a while back about some artists, like even art has a purpose. It's
Right.
beauty and
Dadaism. It's
right.
Yeah.
And there was some artists that tried to create some art that literally had no purpose.
Right, yes. Caleb, maybe we can throw up a picture of some Dadaist art if we can find some that's not going to get us kicked off YouTube and Facebook, because some of it's, watch out, guys. If you research it, some of it's bad. But yeah, Dadaism was an art style that intentionally attempted to create art that was meaningless. But in doing so, the art that they created had a purpose, the purpose being to show that it was meaningless. And then it had meaning. So
you can't get away from it.
You can't get away from it. So with us human beings being created, being a created thing that exists and was made, we must therefore have a purpose. There's probably a whole episode's worth of information on proving what our purpose is. But essentially, the short version is that one of the ways we can discover purpose is by addressing function. This is, I believe it's called the teleological argument.
Yeah.
And mankind has a function, and the function we know from the behavior analytic literature, at least, is that we intake sensory stimuli from the environment. So if you remember from previous episodes, we have that ABC concept. We take in antecedent information, something that we observe, and then we choose to produce a behavioral result from that. And we have multiple mechanisms for that, and there's a whole field of science to study that. But realistically, we take in information, we choose a behavioral response, and then act on that response. So if man functions as essentially a being that observes information and then chooses a response to it, we must have a purpose. And that purpose, I would say, from the teleological viewpoint, is to choose. So man's purpose is to choose. And of course, if we're choosing, it would be to choose rightly.
Yeah.
To choose the right actions, the correct responses to what occurs in the environment.
And ultimately, in choosing, our purpose, as anything, when it fulfills its function, it glorifies the one that made it. It glorifies the creator.
Right, so we can glorify God through choosing rightly, and specifically through choosing him. And I would say even more specifically, and once again, I don't want to do a whole separate episode in the middle of this one, but choosing God and God's way over ourselves and our own way or our own desires. And Solomon's argument in Ecclesiastes essentially says, I did that, I chose myself, And I gave, he, I'm paraphrasing probably here, but he's like, I put, basically he says, I looked at everything there was and I gave myself whatever I saw that I thought I wanted.
Yep.
He got everything he ever wanted, and it wasn't satisfying. And not in the sense that he wasn't grateful for it. Like, we're not talking about somebody who was ungrateful for the gifts he was given. We're talking about someone who did actually get to experience all the best things there were to experience. And it didn't provide enough meaning to make it worth the pursuit of that pleasure.
Right.
And so choosing yourself isn't enough. And the only way to have meaning then from Ecclesiastes then would be to choose God and God's way. The argument I have for that, Aaron, and maybe we should look at some of the Ecclesiastes verses here first, but
So yeah, let's take a look at some of the verses, what the Bible says about meaning and purpose and glorifying God. And Ecclesiastes 12:13 says, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter." So at the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, he went through, the whole book is about him showing that nothing in this life brings meaning and purpose. And so at the end of the book, he said, here's the conclusion: fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. So in other words, glorify God by choosing him and choosing his way.
yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
idea that so the ideas that go with finding purpose and meaning, you can only find purpose and meaning in something that will exist beyond the 6,000 years. Okay, I say
Right.
6,000, but you need something that's genuinely eternal. Since we exist materially in a temporal sense, and that hand's breadth that they're talking about in
Bound by
Psalms,
time.
nothing that we can do materially can have any meaning, which means we have to do something that is eternal for it to be meaningful. So what can we do that is eternal? What choices can we make that are eternal choices? And I think the only choices that could be eternal are when we choose to follow God and God's way. And the reason for that is that it's meaningful to God, at least according to his word. It's
Right.
meaningful to do the things that God says. Basically, it matters to God. And so since it matters to God and God is eternal, we've had an effect on the eternal because we've done something that matters to God.
Right.
Not that we're changing God, because God's immutable, but
No.
it's that.
But how do we know it matters to God? Here's another verse. Exodus 9:16. "And in very deed for this cause have I raised thee up, for to show in thee my power, and that my name may be declared throughout all the earth."
Yeah, okay, so Exodus 9:16 is perfect for this. The idea that we can do anything meaningful materially, we recognize is impossible. But by making choices for God and God's way in the material world, we exist materially as well as extra materially, like spiritually, metaphysically we exist. But the idea that we can choose a certain way to go in the material realm, that the way to make that meaningful is for it to be chosen for an eternal reason. If I can put it into an example, okay, so I work a full-time job on top of this show and all in school, and all the other things I'm doing. And for me it's hard sometimes. I'm not going to complain about it, but it can be challenging and take a lot of effort. And I'm pushing myself through that for a few reasons. But, I could probably work part-time, but then my family's going to suffer for that. So it's tough to do sometimes to work that full-time job, especially when full-time really means unpaid overtime. Let's be honest. You guys out there know what I'm talking about. You've been there. The fact that I'm going to keep doing that and put up with that, I do that so that I'm taking care of my family. It's not because I want to enjoy the pleasures of all the money. I mean, you could do it for that reason, I suppose. But when I choose to do my work for the pleasures that I get from the money, that's material and it's meaningless. But if I choose to work for the reinforcement that's provided by taking care of my family and meeting their needs, well, that's something that God says is the right thing to do. And so if I
Yeah.
do it to please God and follow God's way of being a father to my daughters and a husband to my wife and take care of my family, that's meaningful. If I choose to do this show to try to spread God's word, I mean, it takes a lot of time and effort, and we put a lot of money into the show as well. Uh, those choices, if I did it to try to be famous or something, which, come on, guys, I'm not going to be famous, but if we did it for those reasons, this show is meaningless.
Yeah, which means that the reason why you're doing it matters almost as much as what the action, the thing that you're doing itself.
To break it down behavior analytically, I would say your motivating operations, which we've talked about on the show before, the thing that has value that your behavior is driving to get, is part of the equation that we're doing. But I think even more than that, it's are we going to act based on pleasing the flesh in the short term, or are we going to choose to follow the rules from God's word that he's set out? And I don't mean rules as in do this, don't do this. I mean like the rule govern behavior aspect.
Right.
It's You're
Right.
acting based on the words instead of based on pleasing your flesh.
Right.
That's the layman's terms that I would use
And
for
to
it.
bring this back, what you're saying is to glorify God. We almost think of, well, you have to do some glorious thing in your life,
Mm-hmm.
some big major thing.
Major
But
accomplishments.
right, but 1 Corinthians 10:31 says, "Whether therefore ye eat or drink or whatsoever you do, do all to the glory of God." So everything that
Correct.
we do in life
Every atomic
can
choice,
be
yeah.
glorifying to God. And how is it? We're going to talk more in another episode about this, but in the practicality, it's choosing God and God's way. It's saying, okay, I'm going to choose something. I'm going to choose the eternal versus the temporal, or as you were saying, the choosing to follow the word and the word-based behavior versus my flesh.
Yeah, and there's a great example of it in the Bible. There's the parable of two sons. One son was very excited to go do the task that the father said, and was like, "Oh yeah, Dad, I love you so much. I'm gonna go do it." And then he didn't do it. And then the other one was like, "I don't want to do it. That's stupid, Dad." And then he went and did it anyways. And Jesus says which of these two honored his father. And obviously it's the one that actually did what his father said to do.
Right.
So even though he didn't really, like, he wasn't getting like the pleasure of going and doing that task for his father, he made the choice to follow his father's way and honored his father through that. That's exactly Jesus' parable is
Yeah.
exactly
Yeah.
a reflection of this philosophy from Ecclesiastes, of course, as it would be coming from Christ. Um, it and so for us, the purpose we find, the purpose that will last, the eternal value that's meaningful, is going to come from following after God and God's way and making that choice to follow God and God's way.
Yeah.
I would extend this question to you, Pastor Aaron. Let's say you have two pastors. They both leave. Maybe they went to grad school or not. I don't know. But they both leave pastor school. They go get jobs as pastors. One has a small church, maybe 10, 20 people. Spends his whole life faithfully serving there, honoring God, and he works for God and God's way in that church, even though the great success never comes. And then the other pastor goes and ends up connected and makes this huge, incredible church, but really in his heart, he's making his decisions based on what's going to make me rich and famous and a popular preacher.
Right.
One has a huge congregation and many supporters and probably books written and probably gets published and all that. And the other one just has years and years of faithful service to God. Which one is glorifying God? The one who's chosen himself and glorifying himself, or the one who's chosen to faithfully follow God and God's way, even though it didn't produce earthly
Right.
results?
And that's the difference between the way we look at things and the way God looks at things. Obviously, in God's eyes, it's the one that was choosing God and God's way and being faithful even though he wasn't, from a human standpoint, having a large church and the big
Right.
results.
And some might
and
say
as
he's
we've
not
talked,
successful.
right, but in God's eyes, he is successful,
Right.
because he's chosen God in God's way, and he is glorifying God. Just as we said, we are made, and God has made us, and so therefore he has made us to have a purpose. Isaiah 43:7 says, "Everyone that is called by my name, for I have created him for my glory. I have formed him, yea, I have made him." So the thing is, and I'm glad we're highlighting this, the difference between our version of success and God's version of success is different. And we should follow God's version because he's the one that made us. So he knows what is best for us.
Correct. And to bring it around to the topic of the show so we can wrap things up, when we are following God's version of success, it's successful because it's eternal.
That's right.
And the eternal is what has meaning. So the meaning of life is to choose God and God's way for an eternal result and having eternal value. So choosing eternal value, that is the meaning of life. And practically speaking, we end up specifically rejecting the self and rejecting the things that would benefit ourselves in order to choose the things that benefit God. And in so doing, we make ourselves to be glorifying to God, which has eternal value and then gives us meaning. That's the meaning of life.
Yeah, that's right. Jesus talked about the Pharisees and how they sought the praise of men. And Jesus said of them, they have their reward. The temporal reward that they get from what they're doing, that's all they're ever going to get. But then Jesus contrasted that by saying, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven that aren't going to decay or be stolen or taken away from you. They will last forever, and that is what brings meaning and purpose in our lives.
Well, I certainly think we can't argue with Jesus at this point, so we'll wrap it up with his concepts there. Folks, thanks for joining us today. Before we go, Pastor Aaron, do you want to do that final challenge for us?
Yeah, so the final challenge obviously would be search your own life and find out, do I have meaning and purpose? Am I making choices for the eternal? Am I choosing God's way? And then from there, use that as you talk to other people. You're going to find that others are looking for that meaning and purpose. And so use that purpose and meaning that you have found in God to share God and God's way with them.
I love that. Well, thank you, Pastor Aaron, and thank you to our editor, Caleb, and our producer, David. We appreciate what you guys do for us. And also, as our viewers, we appreciate that you're going to immediately like this video, and you're going to click share, and then leave some comments for us, and do all of those things that help this video be seen. It really does help, and we thank you very much for doing that. It's been great, Pastor Aaron. Thank you for joining us on the show today. We'll see you guys next time on Finding the Point. Have a great day.